All right, this Thursday will mark 1 year since the January 6th riot at the U.S. Capitol. And the left and the legacy media is making sure that they will milk the events of that day for all that they can, especially with the upcoming midterm elections and the forecast not looking too good for Democrats and for the left. Late last week, and I mentioned this at the top of the program, one of the most outrageous headlines that I've ever read in a newspaper, and it was from the Associated Press. And it was not an opinion piece, it was a news article. And this was the title: Slow Motion Insurrection, How GOP Seizes Election Power. Now, the whole focus of the piece was to take a shot at local and state election integrity efforts. And the fact that people are running for office to try to clean up the elections in this country. And they're now trying to tie that into an insurrection. I mean, this is, as I said earlier, this is not only bad journalism, it's dangerous journalism. This is suggesting that people running for office or people who are in office, duly elected by the citizens, who are using the process to change laws or to actually reinforce laws that were already there that were violated in the last election, that somehow that's an insurrection. That's incredible. It's dangerous. With me now to talk about what is really happening at the state level is Hans von Spakovsky, Senior Legal Fellow at the Heritage Foundation and manager of their Election Law Reform Initiative. Hans, welcome back to the program.
Sure, thanks for having me.
I don't know if you saw that AP piece.
I did.
I could not believe they actually had that as the title of the article.
Yeah, and the rest of the article is really one of the most outrageous articles I've ever read. And as you said, this really, it masquerades as a news article, but it's an opinion piece. It's the kind of opinion piece I would expect from a far left advocacy organizations like the ACLU or other organizations like that. And it shows that the AP is no longer really a news gathering organization. It's as bad as MSNBC, and particularly the whole thrust of it, the idea that working for election reform that's supposed to improve the integrity of the election process, that somehow is wrong, that somehow part of an insurrection is just so absurd. I couldn't believe, I thought at first this might be a satire from the Babylon Bee as opposed to a serious article.
But it does reflect, I think, where the legacy media is, and I'm gonna read a couple of different paragraphs here and get you to comment on it. But here's the second paragraph: in battleground states and beyond, Republicans are taking hold of the once overlooked machinery of elections. While the effort is incomplete and uneven, outside experts on democracy and Democrats are sounding alarms, warning the United States is witnessing a slow-motion insurrection with a better chance of success than Trump's failed power grab last year. Now, Hans, let me ask you about this because, let me quote another piece, another paragraph. This time, experts argue, never in the country's modern history has a major party sought to turn the administration of elections into an explicitly partisan act. All right, how do you explain what Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer are doing with For the People Act on Capitol Hill?
Yeah, like I said, this article just simply ignores all this evidence of how the left has been trying to change election rules to the contrary for many, many years. I mean, just to give you one quick example, the left for years has opposed every effort and any effort by states to actually verify the citizenship of individuals who are registering to vote. They claim that's voter suppression. How in the world, when it is a requirement under the law that you be a citizen to vote, for example, in federal elections, how is that suppressing votes to actually verify that somebody is a U.S. citizen? But that's one of the kinds of examples that the left and others give as supposedly a way of engaging in a revolt to actually ensure that our laws are followed in the area of elections.
Well, they're using this term insurrection because that's a very loaded term. And I don't even think it describes what took place at the Capitol a year ago. I think that was a riot, a mob, an unruly mob. It was not an insurrection. But I want to go to, and I want another quote. I'm going to read another part of this article, but then I want to go to what's actually happening in states across the country, because half the states, more than half the states, have been fixing the loopholes in their election laws. So
Right.
all of these states can't be misguided in what they are doing. But I want to go, you made the point about how the left's been working on this for years.
Yes.
Well, they quote in this AP piece, I'm going to be nice here. They say this, they're talking about Michigan, and they quote the former chair of the Michigan Democratic Party. And he says this, quote, "They're laying the groundwork for a slow motion insurrection." So that's where they pulled their headline from. And it's Mark Brewer, an election lawyer and former chair of the Michigan Democratic Party. And then they go on to say the state's top election official, Secretary of State Joycelyn Benson, warned, quote, "The movement to cast doubt on the 2020 election has now turned their eyes to changing the people who were in positions of authority and protected 2020. Now, they don't go on, they don't say anything about the fact that she was put in office primarily by Soros money for the whole purpose of trying to affect elections, and she was a former board member of the Southern Poverty Law Center. How is she a source?
Well, in fact, they failed to mention that in the mid-2000s, George Soros funded and started this political action committee. They called it the Secretaries of State Project, to, in fact, run far left advocates for Secretary of State positions in various states, got them elected in places like Minnesota and Michigan. And the whole point of that was to put these Democratic advocates into positions where they could control election outcomes. The Michigan Secretary of State is the one who, on numerous occasions in last year's elections, decided to violate Michigan state laws that set out the rules for elections. So if there's anyone that's actually engaging in bad behavior, it's the folks who were being quoted in that story.
Well, so what does that tell you about the AP? Either they are very poor journalists and they don't know what they're doing, or there's an intentionality here.
Oh, no, I think there is intentionality. I've had now dealings, and unfortunately with the Associated Press, on election integrity for quite a while, and their partisanship and bias has been evident to me throughout this process. I mean, basically, you can't trust any stories that they write anymore about this particular issue. And, you know, what's so absurd about this, Tony, as you know, is, look, what states have been trying to do, places like Georgia, Texas, Florida, elsewhere, they've been doing things like putting in voter ID requirements. How in the world is that an insurrection? That's something that benefits all voters, no matter which political party they support. But to label that and attempts to clean up voter rolls to, for example, make sure that it's only citizens who are registered, to say that that's insurrection is it got to be one of the most absurd things I've ever heard. And yet this is written as a serious article by the AP.
All right, so I've made my point, folks. You cannot trust what the legacy media is saying. And I would go beyond just the election issue, because I've read so many headlines, and I've never been one to bash the media. But I will tell you that what has happened in the last couple of years is they've dropped the facade. They are clearly a part of the Democratic Party, of the left wing in this country. So, Hans, having established that fact, let's move on now, because I want people to know where to get their information on election reform. They need to go to places like Heritage and the work that you're doing. But let's talk about what's happening in states, because these state legislatures wouldn't be doing this if there was not something that needed to be done.
No, that's exactly right. And that's why in the legislative sessions in the states that occurred at the beginning of 2021, a number of states, Florida, Georgia, Texas, Iowa, Arizona, and several others actually passed big election reform packages to try to fix the vulnerabilities that exist in the system. They've been attacked for doing that. There are lawsuits being filed against them by the Biden Justice Department. But in fact, they passed good reforms. Anybody who doubts that can take a look at the new election integrity scorecard that we now have at the Heritage Foundation that rates the election laws of every state based, looking at them from the standpoint of do they protect security and integrity. And you'll find, boy, there's a lot of states around the country that have serious problems in their election systems.
And that's a great resource, folks, by the way. And in fact, we'll make sure we get that up on our website, or you can follow the links over to Hans's site, because that's a good measure to talk to your state officials about and say, hey, why do we have these vulnerabilities? Why haven't we fixed this? But Hans, I want to go back for just a moment to a point you made about the states that did pass it, because one of the early states to really take on aggressively to fix the problems, it was a state that was under the microscope during the 2020 election. It was Georgia. Right. And Georgia stepped forward, and they did some good stuff in fixing some of the loopholes, trying to limit some of the outside money, the where the voting boxes were dropped, and voter ID. And Brian Kemp, Governor Kemp, to his credit, and I had him on the program many times, he did not wilt in the face of the left's opposition, because they knew if they could stop Georgia, because they were the point man on this, that the other states would fold as well. But to their credit, the state stood, and I think that's why we saw other states move forward in this last legislative session.
Oh, no, I agree. And look, several of the legislators who sponsored what was a really good election reform bill have suffered all kinds of personal and professional consequences for this, including one who lost his job simply because he pushed forward a good election reform bill. But that shows you the problems that there are in this area, and particularly the way the media now is simply repeating liberal talking points whenever it comes to the election integrity issue. And as you know, we're now facing a further problem in the U.S. Congress, because Democrats are about to put forward another push to try to get rid of the filibuster in order to pass their federal election bills, which would basically nationalize the process and ensure dishonest elections for the foreseeable future.
Yeah, as you said, this underscores the problem, but it also underscores what is at stake. Yes. And you listen to the rhetoric, like in the AP article, about undermining democracy. What they're afraid of is that the left, and what they've been working at systematically, which the coronavirus gave them the opportunity to do, it's been exposed. And so Americans are reacting, and state legislatures are reacting. They're fixing these loopholes. And so that's why they're trying to preempt these states and take this at the federal level. And I'm grateful for Senator McConnell and some of the other senators that have stood firm on this, and even some of the Democratic members who are not crazy about this, but we're far from being out of the woods on this one. And so I'm going to, before we run out of time, we'll get an action item on that. But first, what are the top states going into this legislative season where election reform measures are going to be considered?
Well, Pennsylvania is trying it again. Pennsylvania tried to get changes through this past legislative session. It was vetoed by the governor, who later admitted, the Democratic governor, that he hadn't even read the bill. So they are apparently pushing now to try to get this through again, including, by the way, putting in a very good system for having audits after every election to ensure that everything was done the way it should in compliance with the law. And so Pennsylvania is going to be a big focus of election reform efforts as these legislative sessions get underway in January.
Well, folks, you need to speak to those in Pennsylvania. You need to speak to your state officials and encourage them to move forward in this. And again, check out the resource that Hans, they have over at Heritage Foundation that can help you kind of gauge where your state is. Now, Hans, about at the federal level, as you said, they're bringing it back, may try to eliminate the filibuster rules to do it. What do we need to be watching on very quickly?
Folks need to do everything they can to contact their legislators, both at the state and federal level. Their state legislators ought to be calling federal legislators and saying, why do you want to put in a federal law that would take away our ability in our state to formulate the rules running elections? So they need to be doing everything they can to stop what Chuck Schumer and Nancy Pelosi are about to try to do in the Congress.
Yeah, and who knows, it may end up that Dr. Fauci will be head of elections. Hans, great to talk with you. Happy New Year, and I'm sure we'll be talking a lot more in the weeks ahead.
Sure thing. Thanks for having me.
All right.